Alright, now for the Reconstruction after the Civil War. Reconstruction was a very complicated political endeavor. Of course, there were economic and social transgressions that happened, but Reconstruction is probably one of the more important events in American history. Of course, bringing the country back together after the Union and the Confederate States of America had split up, and now the job is to put it back together. However, President Lincoln had been assassinated, and now his vice president, President Johnson, now has basically taken over. So, what are the problems of this peace? Basically, many Northerners thought that the punishment for the South was fairly light. And what I mean by that is the Confederate leaders were held for about 2 years and then released by President Johnson. For example, Jefferson Davis is going to be released, but his citizenship is going to be revoked in 1968, of course. Roughly 100 years after the event, his citizenship is going to be restored by Congress. Now, as far as going back to what was going on in the South at the time of certainly since 1863, 64, 65, and onward, many of the southern cities had collapsed. They'd either been bombarded, they had been looted by maybe Union armies, for example, but also their entire economic system lay in ruin. The Union soldiers did sack southern towns, especially under Sherman's march, which of course accounts for much of the hate of Sherman, definitely by southern citizens, even to this day. But also due to the Emancipation Proclamation and later the 13th Amendment, which is going to outlaw slavery. Basically, this is forcing the South to relearn agricultural methods and also reform their own economic system once again. So basically, the South is starting over. They're going to need money, they're going to need help from the North to rebuild their cities, they're going to have to reassess their agricultural program, and their slaves were now gone. They didn't have access to free labor, so they're going to have to reassess how to pick the cotton and make it profitable. All of this was seen as the North making a muck and a huge upheaval for the southern states. Also, some of the problems is Southern veterans and families not loyal to the Union still existed in the South. They basically, their opinions of the government hadn't changed, especially with all of the aid coming in from the North, as well as some of the political decisions of Congress at the time. And so they cursed basically the United States government. They saw the United States government as intervening in their affairs, which is part of the reason why the war started in the first place. And they basically believed that secession was the correct route, and they continue to think that over the years. So there's a distinct lack of unity between the North and the South, for obvious reasons. But healing that and creating unity between the North and South was going to be a very difficult process. Alright, so first avenue to tackle is going to be the former slaves. Basically, the slaves were emancipated by President Lincoln. This conversation started in 1863, but when the Union soldiers started coming into the South, like Georgia, for example, and eventually the Carolinas, Union troops started to free the slaves once they had conquered basically the South. Many of the Southerners basically re-enslaved the African Americans if they were not protected by Union troops. Many of the Southerners refused to believe slavery was illegal until the state courts, in fact, declared the slaves free. So the attitudes of the Southerners was not in line, and many of the Union troops had to enforce this Emancipation Proclamation and then the 13th Amendment by force, basically threatened them with being stabbed by bayonets or shot. So by force, they removed the slaves from the Southerners' um, ownership. And so many of the Southerners were resentful of that and also used that to state that the United States government was intervening in their daily lives. Now, as far as the slaves are concerned, many of them were very loyal to their plantation owners, and many of them just stayed where they were. Many of them didn't know any life other than with their plantation, so many of them didn't know where to turn. While others simply just left, and of course others basically turned violent towards their slave owners. Some of them were killed, some of their families were killed, other Southerners were killed, and it was a very violent and tumultuous time. So eventually the slaves became free due to force, basically in the end. Now, many of the African Americans were very suspicious of this freedom. They didn't really know if they should celebrate it or what freedom really meant. Many of the African Americans are going to go north with the Union armies, and many of them are also going to go west, where there weren't any Southerners or Northerners. And so many of them, roughly 25,000, are going to make it to Kansas. But for the most part, they are going to remain either in the north or the south. Many of them are going to follow the Union, and some of them just stay put in the plantations they grew up in. But at this point, you also have African Americans being very involved in churches. And so there's going to be a huge influx of population in the Baptist Church, for example, or the African Methodist Church. Huge boon in population in these churches. Many of the African Americans are going to focus on learning how to read and write so they can be involved in society. For example, understanding the contracts that are being written and given to them, and basically so they wouldn't be taken advantage of. Many of the African Americans are certainly going to get involved in education. They're going to build schools, and they're going to build farmland. And basically abolitionists or anti-slavery Northerners are going to come down and teach these people how to read and write, but also how to farm and basically reintegrate them into society, or in fact integrate them into society in the first place. So what also happened was the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau, which happened on March 3rd, 1865. This was created by Congress. And the role of the Freedmen's Bureau was to aid African Americans as well as white refugees. They did teach African Americans, about 200,000 of them, how to read. They gave many of these African American families 40 acres to use for farming, and this land was taken from Confederate families. This land was signed over by General Sherman, and of course there was a lot of outcry by these families, who some of them had lineages going all the way back to when these areas were colonies. And so there was a lot of backlash for this as well. However, very little of this land actually made it to the African American families. And if it did make it to these families, many of the southern landowners would have the African Americans sign contracts, which they didn't understand, which basically gave the land back to white landowners who had it originally. So not a whole lot really happened from this. There's a lot of corruption going on at this time, especially in the South. And so basically a lot of the decisions the Freedmen's Bureau tried to do really didn't make much of a difference. Their major contribution was teaching African Americans how to read and write, but as far as redistributing land, that didn't really work out. So the result was the South despised the Bureau. They saw it as meddling in their own affairs, their state affairs, and so they didn't agree with it, and they tried to shoot it down as soon as possible. In fact, they got President Johnson to agree with them, and he tried to kill the program. However, the Republicans in Congress overturned it until 1872, when the program just expired and ratification did not continue. So, President Johnson, first off, he never attended school, which was very similar to many of the presidents prior to this. He was a tailor at age 10. He taught himself how to read, and he was active in politics since the age of 17. He was elected to Congress at that point. He was basically the champion for poor whites, and he, when the issue of seceding from the Union came up, he refused to secede from the Union. And so when the Union took control over Tennessee, he was appointed as the war governor of Tennessee by the Union. And then later on, he was appointed vice president in 1864 for Lincoln's election bid. And essentially, he was put in there to get Democratic votes for President Lincoln and help the Republicans win, basically, election, with President Lincoln staying where he was. However, he was a champion for states' rights and the Constitution, and basically, he was a president that had some loyalty of the Northerners. He had some loyalty of the Southerners, but also had a lot of disloyalty from both groups as well. He also had the disadvantage of not being elected to office, and basically many people considered him for the wrong man for this job. Essentially, he didn't have any friends. The Northerners didn't like him because of his pro-South policies, and the Southerners didn't like him because he basically did not secede from the Union with Tennessee. So a lot of problems are going to be coming up. So as far as Reconstruction is concerned, the first Reconstruction plan we're going to be talking about, there are 3 different plans as far as it goes. The first plan is going to be Lincoln. And he basically discusses his plan around 1863. His plan is called the 10% Reconstruction Plan. Basically, he thought that the Southerners never legally withdrew from the Union. And so he picked a step process. Step 1 was basically if 10% of the voters from 1860 swore loyalty to the United States and promised to abide by the Emancipation Proclamation, that state would be allowed back into the Union. Once they did that, they would be allowed to form a state government, which many of the Republican congressmen feared that if basically they were allowed to form this state government, they would then reinstitute slavery. So that was a fear of Congress. Lincoln didn't really concern himself too much with it. However, they really didn't go very far. However, basically, the first state that basically went through this process was Louisiana. And when the Louisiana senators came after forming a state government, electing their representatives, Louisiana senators came to the United States Congress in Washington, D.C., and Congress refused to basically seat these senators, and so they didn't have a voice in U.S. Congress. Congress believed the southern states had left the Union and had forfeited their rights. And some of their members wanted to restore the Union very quickly, while some members wanted the South to be punished very severely. So what does this do with Lincoln's plan? Well, his plan was to basically go with the 10% plan, admit them to the Union, have them form a state government, and then they would agree to follow through with the Emancipation Proclamation and then go forth as business is concerned. However, unfortunately, President Lincoln is going to be assassinated very soon after the war, so it's hard to say what would have actually happened. So Louisiana, for example, they sent senators, but they weren't allowed to be recognized, and therefore they didn't have a voice in Congress. So this brings us to President Johnson. President Johnson came up with his own Reconstruction plan since President Lincoln was no longer alive. Basically, he stuck with Lincoln's 10% plan, meaning that 10% of the population from 1860 would swear loyalty to the Constitution, the United States, and abide by the Emancipation Proclamation. Basically, he recognized all the states that had already gone through this 10% process. However, he started making other decisions. Basically, any Confederate owning property over 20,000 would get their property confiscated by the Union. And all the states that wanted to become part of the United States would have to repeal secession. He also absolved all Confederate debt that had accrued during the Civil War. So the Confederate states had accrued quite a bit of debt from, for example, their debt that accrued prior to the secession. That was absolved, as well as debt accrued by buying products from, say, France or Britain. So this kind of pissed off a lot of people. And then finally, these states had to ratify the 13th Amendment, which basically outlawed slavery. So you can look at the 13th Amendment on your own time, but this was the process in which the states would have to go through, and many of them did go through this process. Not all at the same time, but gradually all the states did go through this process. Now, as far as the southern states' reaction to the 13th Amendment, many of them did agree and ratify the 13th Amendment, but they made laws within their own state to basically regulate African Americans. Basically, they made laws to basically work past the 13th Amendment. Basically, they wanted to keep their social status from the pre-war. They also needed labor and wanted labor for their plantations. A lot of them did rely on cotton, for example. And so as a result, many of them made these laws that and they had a lot of these African Americans sign contracts, work contracts, and so they made these laws that if they left, they could not pay them. African Americans were also forbade from marrying, serving on a jury, renting land, and even voting. Also, what happened was if they were displeased with the work that had been done, they could forfeit pay. Or if they just were displeased in general, and nothing is defining what it meant by displeasing. So basically, what these were called were black codes, and each state had their own set of black codes. What these codes basically did was re-enslave the African Americans. So because of this, the Union, or the North, were wondering if they'd actually won the war, or if they had gained anything from fighting all of these battles. So because of this, Congress makes its own Reconstruction plan. Basically what happened was many southern states started to elect former generals and statesmen of the Confederate States of America to the United States Congress. So on December 4th, 1865, the United States Congress, which was of course dominated by Republicans, basically closed the door in the face of the Southern congressmen. They locked the door and didn't let them in. So also, the southern states enjoyed a greater amount of representation in Congress because African Americans are now counted as a whole person instead of 3/5 of a person. So now they can actually dominate Congress once let in. So the Republican Congress feared that Democrats would take control of Congress, which they would have if they were allowed to enter Congress. They also feared that they would elect a Democratic president and that they would basically re-enslave the African Americans, and all the work of the Civil War would be destroyed. On December 6, 1865, President Johnson announced that the Union had been restored, and so now the United States is whole, and basically announcing that he had done Reconstruction, everything is done and complete, and move on with business. So, this starts to clash with the Republican Congress and Johnson and many of the Southern congressmen. So basically, in February of 1866, Johnson vetoes an extension of the Freedmen's Bureau, trying to get rid of it. Of course, he's going to fail. Congress is going to override him. March of 1866, they form a civil rights bill which would give African Americans the privilege of American citizenship, and this was supposed to counter the black codes. If they are a citizen, then these black codes will not apply to them. President Johnson is going to veto this bill. Congress, which is dominated by Republicans, is going to pass the bill with a 2/3 majority vote, and of course, that is going to beat his veto. This is going to be a continuous theme throughout basically his presidency. There's going to be a battle between Congress and the president, which is going to be veto after veto is going to be beat by Congress. So Congress fears that a Southern president, which might be elected, might repeal the Civil Rights Bill. So they decide to make that bill into an amendment. Of course, this is going to be the 14th Amendment. It's going to be approved by Congress in 1866 and then the states in 1868. Basically, what this means is all persons born or naturalized in the United States, which would include former slaves or freed slaves, would become citizens. And then, therefore, if their liberties were denied, that would be unconstitutional. So, Republicans agreed that the southern states needed to ratify the amendment. Some congressmen were disappointed that it didn't go far enough by giving African Americans the right to vote, but basically Congress decided that that might be a step too far. Maybe later down the road, that would be something they could do. Of course, they didn't realize that might not be 1960s. However, President Johnson is going to encourage states to refuse the amendment. So, congressional elections are going to be pivotal to this process. Basically, President Johnson is going to go around the country, accuse Congress of being radicals, and basically anti-black at that time, and that they are going to cause widespread riots and murder in the South. Part of the problem was President Johnson, he drank heavily, especially during these meetings and tours around the United States, and he would start to argue with the general public, which basically hurt his reputation quite significantly. And so public opinion changed to stand with Congress because they trusted Congress more than their president. And so Congress became a Republican Congress. So now Republicans could beat pretty much everything that the president could throw at them, basically as a veto-proof Congress. So basically, Congress at this point wants to reconstruct the South economically and socially, and many of them wanted to basically have equal rights for African Americans, but many of the moderates in Congress decided that the states basically had to keep citizens' rights in mind and make sure the citizen rights were upheld, and then later on, through the states, they would actually basically be more in line with the Union. So a backwards way of actually getting the job done. So they would start the Reconstruction Act of, which will start March 2nd, 1867. This divided the South into 5 military districts, which is going to be policed by 20,000 troops. You're going to also have all the states once again readmit to be part of the United States, which they would have to ratify the 14th Amendment. and have it guaranteed to be in the state constitution, and full suffrage for all adult male or former adult male slaves. It did not give recently free men land or education, but it was supposed to give them the right to vote. And hopefully, down the road, the state government would have African Americans involved in its government. They also believed that if the federal government really got involved, this would backfire and wouldn't actually accomplish much of anything. If the federal government did not intervene, then they could not argue that this federal government was intervening in their own state. That was a strong call, but of course, you could argue with them forcing to ratify the 14th Amendment was a lot of federal intervention as well. So either way, it's kind of a lose-lose. Now, Congress was still very fearful that the southern states were going to deny foreign slaves, as well as free slaves, their rights. And so they added the 15th Amendment in. Basically, the rights of citizens in the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. This is going to be passed in 1869, and it's also going to be ratified by the states in 1870. So they're going to have to ratify the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to be part of the United States. So the Union troops were there to basically enforce this, make sure that the Southern citizens did not restrict the rights of the African Americans. This was seen as necessary because during the Civil War, they were necessary for plantation owners to release their slaves, and so they continued this throughout the 1860s and 70s. The first Union troops started to leave in 1870 when it seemed that the states had followed all the provisions that Congress had put forth. In 1877, the last Union soldier leaves the southern states, and soon after that, the southern governments started to become democratic and go back essentially to their ways prior to the Union troops. All right, so basically, what we have is a situation where you have these amendments in place, and for the most part, legally at least, they could not restrict these rights. However, they did still find ways to basically remove rights from the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. So African Americans start to become part of the South. They start working jobs, they start farming, start manufacturing, what have you. Basically what happens is they do get the right to vote. They do start to organize politically. They actually call themselves the Union League, which was an organization to network with political clubs throughout basically the southern states, and they generally elected Republican candidates. They would build churches and schools for African Americans, but there's going to be groups that don't believe African Americans should be educated. And so these groups cause a lot of disdain for white Southerners, as well as when black or African American delegates start to form their own representatives and start getting involved in government. So basically, what we have through this process, at least the government, is they did recognize they needed reforms. And they recognized they needed a good public schooling system. Their tax code streamlined, property rights were going to be guaranteed to women, public works projects like plumbing, roads were being built, but because of a lot of political corruption, a lot of this didn't actually get accomplished. The politicians started using African Americans as basically pawns. They basically knew they weren't really acclimated to the world they were living in, so many of them took advantage of them. There was bribery among much of the political leaders, and as a result, the South became very similar to the North. Many Northerners started using African Americans as basically pawns. Racism starts to really come apparent in the North as well, and so the North and South aren't actually that much different. However, in the South, due to this disdain of African Americans being involved in basically government, there is a group that is formed, which is very famous now, the KKK and the Ku Klux Klan. It was founded in 1866. Basically, it was a campaign of terror to intimidate through words or by force in some cases African Americans to stay away from schools or any sort of political institution. And at first it was through words, intimidation. Don't go or we'll hurt you or your family. But then in some cases, violence was used. For example, in 1868, 200 African Americans are killed. But also you're going to have people who helped the African Americans. They are also going to be killed as well or beat up. So because of this, African Americans, as well as some supporters of African Americans, stayed away from the polls, which of course allowed some of the more anti-African American candidates to get elected or laws to be passed. So Congress passed the Force Acts of 1870, 1870 and as well as 1871. They sent federal troops to go down into the South and find the KKK and arrest them. However, the KKK hid amongst many church groups or rifle clubs, and they basically disappeared into society. Finally, and of course, they weren't able to completely root out the KKK. So, in 1890, came a law that disenfranchised the African Americans. Basically, they formed a literacy tests. If African Americans could not read or write certain phrases, then they would not be allowed to vote. And they would, of course, be very clever and use big words or some of the most educated individuals to form these tests. And so then African Americans were never really allowed to vote, or they were intimidated to not vote if they did pass. And of course, many of these tests, white folks would not be able to actually pass them either, but they never took the test. So that was the problem there. So as a result, African Americans really, while on paper with the amendments, they were viewed as equal. They clearly weren't equal in reality. So in 1867 and 1868, Republicans got disgusted with the president really trying to cause problems. He was drunk a lot and really didn't help the situation. And so as a result, in 1867, they had the Tenure of Office Act put forth. Basically what it was the consent of the Senate was needed to remove an appointee from basically the presidential council. Johnson removed Stanton, which was the Secretary of War. And so Congress used this as grounds for impeachment. The impeachment vote occurred, and it was 126 to 47 in favor of impeachment. So because of that, then you have the impeachment trial. And 1,000 tickets were printed and sold to the general public to view the impeachment trial, so they did use this for entertainment purposes. President Johnson argued that the law was unconstitutional and fired Stanton to test the case for the Supreme Court. So basically, he's arguing that he knew this was unconstitutional, and to prove it, he fired Stanton in order to prove to Congress that it was unconstitutional. President Johnson did not get impeached, and that was only due to one vote. However, Johnson knew that he was unpopular, and so he agreed to stay in office, and he would stop obstructing Congress. And so he would stop basically trying to veto or cause problems with Congress. And so he decided to basically be president and let Congress do what it wanted, and he would sign the bills whenever they came across his desk. So basically, Reconstruction. All in all, quick summary, the South despised basically this huge upheaval in their social and racial system. They despised the empowerment of African Americans, and they despised the federal intervention in their local affairs. And this is going to last generations upon generations upon generations. Republicans, on the other hand, or the North, wanted to protect African Americans and former slaves, also promote their party, but due to basically the Southern's individuals, their successes were very scant. And what actually happened, basically, is the country, the North and the South, basically decided to compromise, to not bother one another. They certainly could have sent more troops down to the South to enforce and remove this illicit law, but they decided that that would be too much work, and they didn't want to see the United States split again. They wanted the healing process to actually occur. And so basically, once again, much like what happened in 1789 with the United States Constitution, a political decision was made not to mess around with the institution of slavery. In this case, they stopped messing around with the institution of Southern states, essentially stop bothering the Southern states to get their act together. And so it would be another 100 years or so before African Americans would get the rights that they deserved from the very beginning. And so it's a very sad time for American history. Once again, they try to fix a problem and it fails. The healing process for the North and South is finally going to begin, unfortunately, once again, with the basically the Spanish-American War of 1898. The North and the South are going to go to war with Spain, and they're going to take Cuba. And this was a uniting force because this required cooperation from the North and the South. And so this was a healing process for that. Prior to that, the North and South were essentially separate entities. So due to warfare, it was a uniting force. And of course, African Americans really didn't have much of a role to play. They were still being discriminated against, and it really wasn't a good situation for them. And so they're going to essentially, African Americans are going to have to wait another 100 years or so until the 1960s to get the rights recognized and equality taking another step forward. So as far as was the Civil War worth it, hard to really argue that it was. Certainly, with the Constitution getting the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments was progress, but at the same time, African Americans really didn't get the rights they deserved, and there was a lot lost in life, and certainly the southern states didn't really seem to change a great deal. But nevertheless, that is a discussion for another time, but this is where I leave you.